Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time we're going to try to unpack this really complex topic of housing discrimination. It looks like you guys sent in some really great sources for this one. An Investopedia article called Housing Discrimination, What Is It and What Can You Do About It? And then also this excerpt that's really focused on this issue in Southern California. And it sounds like you're interested in not just recognizing housing discrimination, but also what legal protections are out there and how you can actually fight back if you ever encounter it.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's a great goal. I think that's where we all want to get to. And it's a multifaceted issue, and it's got some, pretty deep historical roots that still impact the housing market even today.
Right. And so I guess let's just start with defining. I mean, both articles provide a definition. Yeah. But I'm curious, from your experience, what's the most common misconception people have about what actually constitutes housing discrimination?
Yeah, a lot of people think it's only outright refusal of housing based on someone's protected characteristics. A landlord explicitly saying, we don't rent to people of your race. But housing discrimination is so much broader than that. It can be, subtle, even unintentional sometimes.
So things like unexpectedly hitting roadblocks in the application process,
yeah.
Or maybe being steered towards certain neighborhoods, or quoted different prices. I mean, the Investopedia article even had some examples of what they call red flag language from real estate agents, saying, I don't think you'd be comfortable in this neighborhood.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, those are classic examples of steering, which is illegal under fair housing laws. And it doesn't even matter if the agent thinks they're being helpful. The impact is still discriminatory.
Because it limits choices and reinforces existing segregation, right?
Yeah, exactly. And remember, it's not just about race or ethnicity. Federal law actually protects against discrimination based on race, color, religion, national origin, sex. And when we say sex, we mean gender identity, sexual orientation, and sexual harassment.
Yeah.
And familial status and disability.
And here in California, we have even broader protections, including sexual orientation, gender identity, and source of income. I was actually surprised to learn from the Investopedia article that it's illegal to discriminate against someone just because they use a housing voucher.
Yeah. That's a really common misconception. A lot of people assume landlords can just refuse tenants based on their source of income. But in California, at least that's not the case. And that's crucial considering how many people rely on those housing assistance programs.
Speaking of eye-opening statistics, the Investopedia article mentioned this 2019 Newsday investigation. And they said Black testers experienced disparate treatment 49% of the time when trying to buy homes on Long Island. That's alarmingly high. And it makes me wonder, how much of today's housing discrimination is rooted in those historical practices mentioned the Southern California article, like redlining and racial covenants.
Yeah, I mean, it's a direct connection. Practices like redlining, which systematically denied loans and services to residents of certain areas based on race or ethnicity. Those are no longer legal. But the effects are still felt today. It's this ripple effect that has led to, these persistent disparities in wealth. And, access to opportunities. There was this 2019 Urban Institute analysis, and it found a massive difference in housing wealth between Black and white homeowners. And that gap can be directly attributed to these historical practices.
So even though, these practices are outlawed, their legacy continues to shape the housing landscape. Yeah. I mean, it makes you realize that historical discrimination isn't just a past issue. It continues to impact communities today.
Absolutely. Understanding this context is crucial to really grasping the complexity of housing discrimination today. But, let's delve a little bit deeper into some of these present-day examples. We've talked about these subtle forms of discrimination, but I'm sure you're curious about how these actually manifest in real-life scenarios, especially in a place like Southern California.
Yeah, you read my mind. The Southern California article briefly mentions discrimination based on technology.
Yeah.
What exactly does that look like?
It's an interesting and evolving area, with algorithms and online platforms playing a bigger role in, housing searches and applications. There's a risk of perpetuating bias in new ways, often unseen ways.
So you mean those targeted ads that might exclude certain groups, or even those tenant screening tools that use algorithms to assess applicants? I hadn't really considered how those could be discriminatory.
Yeah, it's subtle but potentially very impactful. For example, an algorithm could be designed in a way that inadvertently favors applicants with certain zip codes or types of employment, which can have a disparate impact on communities of color or those with lower incomes.
That's a great point. It shows how technology, if not carefully designed and monitored, can actually reinforce existing inequality.
Exactly. And it highlights the need for greater scrutiny and regulation to ensure that these tools are being used fairly. But let's shift gears for a moment and talk about what's being done to combat some of these issues. Both articles mention the Fair Housing Act, but to be honest, I'm a bit fuzzy on how it's actually been used to address housing discrimination.
Yeah. The Fair Housing Act of 1968 was a landmark piece of legislation, but it initially only covered a few protected classes. And over the years, it's been amended to include more, like gender, disability, and familial status.
And crucially, it's been used to address not just intentional discrimination, but also policies that have what we call a disparate impact. This means that even if a rule or practice doesn't explicitly target a certain group, if it negatively affects them disproportionately, it can still be considered discriminatory.
So even if a landlord doesn't say no families with children, if their rental criteria end up excluding most families with kids, that could be a problem, right?
Exactly. This concept of disparate impact has been a key tool for challenging policies that might seem neutral on the surface but perpetuate inequality in practice. And it's important to understand that the fight for fair housing is an ongoing process. The Investopedia article mentioned the Trump administration made some changes that made it harder to prove disparate impact claims.
That's right. And there was a lot of pushback from housing advocates who argued that those changes weakened protections for vulnerable communities.
Yes, and under the Biden administration, there have been efforts to reverse those changes and reinstate stronger protections. It's this constant tug of war, unfortunately. But it's also why staying informed about these shifts is so important.
Definitely. It's like trying to hit a moving target. But let's get practical for a moment. If someone listening suspects they've experienced housing discrimination, what are the first steps they should take?
Documentation is key. Think like a detective. Take detailed notes during interactions with landlords, real estate agents, or lenders.
The Investopedia article had some good tips, like noting any red flag language and tracking any unexpected roadblocks, like if a unit is suddenly unavailable after you mention your source of income.
Exactly. And if you're denied housing, see if the property is still available later. When it comes to mortgages, compare the rates you're offered to the bank's publicly listed rates to check for any discrepancies.
It's all about gathering as much evidence as possible to support your claim. Then where do you go from there?
You can file a complaint with HUD, the federal agency that enforces fair housing laws.
And here in California, we have state and local agencies you can contact as well.
Right. Plus, there are fair housing organizations all over the country that are incredible resources. They can help gather evidence, file complaints, and even offer legal assistance.
So knowing your rights is one thing, but knowing who to turn to if those rights are violated is just as important. It sounds like these fair housing organizations play a really vital role.
They really do. They're often the boots on the ground working directly with individuals and communities to fight discrimination. But beyond filing complaints, what else can be done?
Well, the Southern California article mentioned community land trusts as one innovative approach to creating more affordable and equitable housing options. I have to admit I'd never heard of those before. Could you explain how they work?
It's like taking the land itself out of the speculative market and ensuring that housing built on it remains affordable, for the community.
That's the idea. So the land is held in trust. So it can't be just like sold off to the highest bidder. And that helps keep those housing prices, stable. And it gives those residents a greater sense of ownership and control over their neighborhoods.
Right, yeah.
It seems like a really promising model, especially in areas like Southern California where the cost of housing is such a major challenge. But alongside these innovative solutions, both articles really stress the importance of awareness and education when it comes to, combating housing discrimination.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we've talked about the legal frameworks and resources available, but ultimately it's about changing hearts and minds. People need to understand their rights, but also recognize how their own biases, even unconscious ones, can perpetuate discrimination.
Yeah. It makes me think about that testing that we discussed earlier. It's not just about catching those bad actors. It's about exposing the ways in which bias can be embedded in seemingly neutral practices.
Exactly. Testing can be a powerful tool for shining a light on these hidden forms of discrimination and pushing for systemic change.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into housing discrimination, what's the key takeaway you want to leave our listener with?
I think the most important thing is to remember that this is an ongoing fight. We've come a long way since the days of outright segregation, but housing discrimination is still a pervasive problem, often manifesting in, subtle and insidious ways.
And it's not just a legal issue. It's a social issue, a moral issue. It's about creating a society where everyone has a fair chance to live in a safe, affordable, and welcoming community, regardless of, their race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, or any other protected characteristic.
That's beautifully said. I think it's important to recognize that we all have a role to play in this fight. It's not just the job of lawmakers or fair housing organizations. It's about each of us examining our own biases, educating ourselves and others, and speaking out against injustice when we see it.
It's about being allies, about being advocates, about demanding a more equitable housing landscape for everyone.
Exactly. And those actions, no matter how small they may seem, can have a ripple effect and contribute to lasting change.
This has been such an insightful and informative deep dive. Thank you for sharing your expertise and helping us unpack this really complex topic.
It's been a pleasure.
And to you, our listener, thank you for joining us on this journey. We hope you learned something new and feel empowered to be a part of the solution. Remember, knowledge is power. And together we can create a world where everyone has a place to call home. Until next time, stay curious and keep fighting the good fight.
Yeah, it's like taking the land itself out of that speculative market and ensuring that housing built on it remains affordable, for the community.
Oh, okay. So the land is held in a trust and it can't be sold off to the highest bidder. So that helps keep housing prices stable, and it gives residents a greater sense of ownership and control over their neighborhood.
Right.
That's really interesting. It seems like a really promising model, especially in areas like Southern California where the cost of housing is such a major challenge. But alongside these innovative solutions, both articles really stress the importance of awareness and education when it comes to combating housing discrimination.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. We talked about the legal frameworks and the resources, but at the end of the day, it's really about changing hearts and minds. People need to understand their rights, but also recognize how their own biases, even unconscious ones, can perpetuate discrimination.
Right. And it makes me think about that testing that we discussed earlier. It's not just about catching those bad actors. It's about exposing the ways in which bias can be embedded in seemingly neutral practices.
Yeah, exactly. Testing can be a powerful tool for shining a light on these hidden forms of discrimination and then pushing for systemic change.
Well, as we wrap up this deep dive into housing discrimination, what's one key takeaway you want to leave our listener with today?
I think the most important thing is to remember that this is an ongoing fight. We've come a long way since the days of outright segregation. But housing discrimination is still a really pervasive problem, and it often manifests in these subtle and insidious ways.
Yeah. And it's not just a legal issue. It's a social issue. It's a moral issue.
Yeah.
It's about creating a society where everyone has a fair chance to live in a safe and affordable and welcoming community, regardless of race or ethnicity or gender or sexual orientation or any other protected characteristic.
Yeah, beautifully said. And I think it's important to remember that we all have a role to play in this fight. It's not just the job of lawmakers or fair housing organizations. It's about each of us, examining our own biases, educating ourselves and others, and speaking out against injustice when we see it.
Yeah, it's about being allies. It's about being advocates. It's about demanding a more equitable housing landscape for everyone.
Exactly. And those actions, no matter how small they may seem, they can have a ripple effect and contribute to lasting change.
This has been such an insightful and informative deep dive. Thank you for sharing your expertise with us today and helping us unpack this complex topic.
It's been my pleasure.
And to you, our listener, thank you so much for joining us on this journey. We hope you learned something new today and that you feel empowered to be a part of the solution. Remember, knowledge is power. And together we can create a world where everyone has a place to call home. Until next time, stay curious and keep fighting the good fight.
Call now 714-442-9741. Thank you.